In 1919, one of the most hated men in America took his final breath inside a mansion that had become a fortress of wealth, defiance, and ambition. Henry Clay Frick, the steely magnate who once crushed labor strikes with force and faced bullets with eerie calm, died surrounded not by the public fury he had ignited for decades, but by marble walls and priceless art. He was loathed, not loved, feared, not admired. And yet, more than a century later, that same mansion is one of New York's most revered cultural institutions. Crowds gather not to protest, but to admire. They queue not with picket signs, but with admission tickets. And they don't curse Frick's name. They thank it. What happened? How did a man once synonymous with corporate brutality become remembered, even celebrated, through architecture? The paradox is compelling. How could a man so publicly vilified for his role in the Homestead Strike, for allowing blood to be spilled at the gates of industry, be reimagined as a patron of the arts? The truth lies not in apology, but in strategy. Frick never asked for forgiveness. He never made speeches defending himself. He let his buildings speak. Where others shrank from controversy, he built through it. He outlasted it. He shaped narratives not with words, but with walls, and those walls remain. Before we go further, take a moment to be part of this story. If you're fascinated by how wealth, art, and reputation collide across history, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing this community grow across the globe. And if this mystery has already pulled you in, share this video with a friend who enjoys untangling the past. Let us know in the comments. What do you think the true mystery behind the title is? We're just getting started. Frick built 3 monumental homes during his lifetime: Clayton in Pittsburgh, Eagle Rock in Newport, and the palatial 1 East 70th Street mansion in New York. Each residence was more than a display of wealth. Each one was a stone and mortar statement, deliberately positioned and designed to outlast headlines and hatred. Together, they form a trilogy of transformation, from a fortress erected in the shadow of a bloody labor war to a summer palace for high society, and finally to a neoclassical monument that would become both museum and mausoleum. These houses were never meant to be just lived in. They were meant to be remembered, and that is exactly what happened. The most famous of them, the Fifth Avenue Mansion, stands today as a cultural treasure. Its rooms contain works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Turner, and Goya. But the walls themselves are just as eloquent. They whisper of ambition, violence, and an attempt to rewrite memory through aesthetics. For decades, people tried to forget who Frick was. But ironically, it's the mansion he built, an attempt at erasing his own sins, that has kept his name immortal. History has a strange sense of irony. The man who tried to control every narrative in life left behind a building that forced us to revisit his legacy, again and again. This is not a feel-good story about the triumph of beauty. It is a story about how power survives, not just through money, but through architecture, location, design, and the ability to co-opt culture itself. Frick's story is not that he built beautiful houses. Many of his contemporaries did the same. It's that his houses still stand while theirs have been forgotten, dismantled, or replaced by glass towers and parking garages. The Vanderbilt's architectural excess was razed. The Astor's legacy is barely traceable. But Frick's residence has become a temple of refinement and cultural prestige, and in this, he won. His strategy worked. Today, few visitors to the Frick collection dwell on Homestead or the Pinkertons or the attempted assassination. Instead, they marvel at the grandeur of the West Gallery, the intimacy of the library, the serenity of the garden court. They speak of Frick's taste, not his tyranny. His name is no longer just attached to factory brutality. It's linked to culture, to art, to preservation. And that transformation is not accidental. It was the endgame of a man who believed that architecture could outlast public opinion, that buildings could do what reputations could not: endure. And that brings us to the central mystery of this story. Why did Henry Clay Frick's mansions survive when so many others crumbled? Why do people stand in line to enter the home of a man once called America's most hated capitalist? What did Frick understand that others missed? And what does his architectural legacy tell us? Not just about him, but about the way America chooses to remember its powerful men. This series explores the answer through the lens of the three houses he built. Clayton in Pittsburgh was his first declaration of permanence. It was not just a home, it was a fortress, built during a time of violence and shaped by the need to protect. Then came Eagle Rock in Newport, a summer estate that offered Frick the illusion of social acceptance among East Coast elites. It gave him proximity to old money, but never full membership. And finally, 1 East 70th Street in Manhattan, the magnum opus, a mansion built not for family, but for posterity, a house meant to become a museum, designed to survive demolition, criticism, and even time itself. This is a story of power told in stone, a tale of how art, architecture, and wealth intersected to rewrite one man's reputation. And by the end, we will confront a question as relevant now as it was in Frick's time. Can beauty erase brutality? Can a museum, no matter how elegant, ever truly separate itself from the blood that built it? Now, let's step back into Pittsburgh, where it all began. Before he was a name etched into a marble plaque outside one of New York's finest museums, Henry Clay Frick was a boy born into modest means in the backcountry of western Pennsylvania. The year was 1849. The place was a farmhouse in West Overton, a Mennonite settlement where industry had not yet replaced the land. His family lived simply. His father, a miller, struggled with money, and Frick's formal education ended at 17. There was no early indication of the empire he would build. But inside young Frick, there existed a quiet, unshakable certainty. He would not be poor forever. And more than that, he would never be insignificant. At age 21, Frick made a decision that would alter not just his fate, but the future of American industry. He borrowed money from relatives and invested in the one resource Pittsburgh's steel-hungry mills couldn't get enough of: coke. Not the drink, but the industrial fuel made by baking coal in ovens to remove impurities. Coke was the lifeblood of steel, and steel was fast becoming the backbone of American infrastructure, from railroad tracks to skyscrapers. Frick didn't invent the coke oven, but he revolutionized its business model. He operated with surgical precision, squeezing profits from every ounce of raw material, undercutting competitors, and buying out struggling operations until his firm, Frick Coke Company, controlled nearly 80% of the coke supply feeding Pittsburgh's voracious steel mills. His rise was ruthless. He ignored safety, slashed wages, and eliminated anything that cut into profit. To Henry Clay Frick, Human sympathy was a distraction. What mattered was scale, control, efficiency. By his mid-20s, he was a millionaire, a staggering fortune in the 1870s. His success did not come from innovation or brilliance in metallurgy, but from his ability to dominate a system and extract its maximum yield. And that trait, above all else, made him invaluable to a man who would change the face of American industry: Andrew Carnegie. In 1881, Carnegie approached Frick with a proposal that was less a partnership than a strategic alliance of opposites. Carnegie, the idealist and public-facing intellectual, needed a steady supply of coke for his steel mills. Frick, the pragmatic executioner of capitalism, had the coke and the will to push men and machines beyond their limits. Carnegie bought a large share in Frick's company. Frick became chairman of Carnegie Steel. The marriage was never affectionate, but it was wildly effective. Carnegie played the benevolent philosopher king. Frick played the unflinching general. Together, they turned Pittsburgh into the steel capital of the world. Yet even as he built wealth, Frick remained an outsider in polite society. He was rich, but not respected. He had power, but not Polish. He understood that in Gilded Age America, fortunes needed facades, and so he studied, not books, but blueprints. He looked at what the Vanderbilts had built in New York, what the Whitneys had built in Newport, what the Morgans and Astors had chosen to live in. He understood instinctively that money alone wouldn't grant him a seat at the table. He would need architecture, grandeur, permanence, the right address, and a home that didn't whisper arrival but roared it. In 1882, he married Adelaide Howard Childs, a woman of social standing from a prominent Pittsburgh family. She was not just a wife, but a co-strategist. Adelaide knew how to navigate society's silent codes. She understood what kind of furniture spoke of lineage, what kind of silver pattern meant heritage, and which architects could elevate a house into a statement. Their marriage was reportedly affectionate, but it was also strategic. Together, they began to plan their first major residence, not a comfortable home, but a fortress of status that would silence any doubts about Frick's place among the elite. The location they chose was symbolic: Penn Avenue, in Pittsburgh's most prestigious East End neighborhood, surrounded by the city's old money families and away from the smoke and clangor of the mills. The land itself was expansive, capable of holding not just a house but gardens, stables, and eventually a greenhouse. To live here was to say, I have arrived, not merely financially, but socially. And for Frick, whose fortune was born in furnaces and violence, that kind of announcement mattered. Frick's obsession with control extended to every detail of the construction. He didn't merely approve budgets. He reviewed blueprints, interrogated architects, and oversaw timelines. He wasn't building something ephemeral or fashionable. He was building something eternal. This house would be his banner, his rebuttal to those who called him a brute, his entry into the club of men whose wealth was indistinguishable from their identity. But behind this ambition lay a brutal truth. The fortune that financed these grand plans came directly from the suffering of others. The coke ovens that made Frick rich operated day and night, often in lethal conditions. Workers inhaled toxins, burned their skin, and worked for wages that barely kept their families alive. Child labor was common. Deaths were frequent. When workers tried to organize for safer conditions or better pay, Frick was merciless. He saw labor as an obstacle, not a partner. In his world, if a man could not survive the fire, he did not belong in it. Frick did not apologize for this worldview. He called it progress, survival of the fittest, industrialized. The weak fell behind. The strong built limestone mansions and filled them with European oil paintings. He would not bend to public opinion. He would not reform. He would outlast. By 1890, Frick's annual income had exceeded $1 million, equivalent to over 30 million today. He was only 39. In an era where the average worker earned less than $10 a week. Frick had ascended into a stratosphere few could even imagine. And yet, for all his wealth, he remained a man acutely aware of perception. He knew that unlike Carnegie, whose name would be on libraries and universities, his own legacy was at risk of being reduced to brutality and greed. And so, he doubled down on a different kind of monument. Not books or philanthropy, but buildings, structures of such elegance and permanence that they could not be ignored. He would not write essays on the responsibility of wealth. He would demonstrate it through iron, wood, stone, and glass. What Frick began in Pittsburgh was not just a home, but a pattern. With each new property, he crafted not only a physical space but an argument that money, when shaped by vision and executed with ruthless intent, could transcend even the worst reputations. The man who started in a farmhouse was now sketching out plans for a fortress. But his next chapter would show just how far he was willing to go to protect that empire, and just how many would suffer to keep it standing. In the summer of 1892, Henry Clay Frick made a decision that would define him for the rest of his life, a decision that would stain his reputation more deeply than any fortune could polish away. The Homestead Steel Strike did not erupt suddenly. It simmered for months, fueled by resentment, fear, and the widening gulf between workers struggling for survival and the industrialists who commanded their livelihoods. But it was Frick who poured gasoline on the embers. As chairman of Carnegie Steel, he believed compromise was weakness and negotiation, a concession he could not afford. So he prepared for war. The Homestead plant, located just outside Pittsburgh, was one of the largest steelworks in the world. The workers, members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, expected to renegotiate their contract, hoping for fair wages and safer conditions. Frick saw their demands as an affront. He believed the union threatened the efficiency he prized above all else. In his worldview, a factory ran best under one will, his. And so, in an act that would shock the nation, he ordered a massive fence erected around the plant. It stretched 3 miles and stood 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire and punctuated with watchtowers. Workers nicknamed it Fort Frick, a grim symbol of the battle to come. Inside that fortress, Frick installed armed guards, searchlights, and enough supplies to withstand a prolonged conflict. Outside, thousands of workers gathered, furious but determined. They knew Frick intended to replace them with non-union labor, an insult that cut deeper than the wage cuts he had proposed. What happened next was not a strike. It was a siege, and in Frick's mind, it was a test, not of labor relations, but of dominance. On July 6, 1892, Frick authorized a plan so dramatic it reads like fiction. Under cover of night, he hired 300 Pinkerton agents, private paramilitary forces infamous for their violent union-busting tactics. They approached Homestead on 2 barges floating up the Monongahela River, intending to secure the mill before sunrise. But thousands of workers and townspeople spotted the armed men drifting toward them and rushed to the riverbank in a wave of panic, rage, and desperation. the conflict ignited instantly. Gunfire erupted before the barges even touched shore. Workers hurled rocks, fired rifles, and attempted to push back the Pinkertons, who shot back from behind steel shields. The exchange lasted 12 brutal hours. The river ran red. By the end, 10 men were dead, 7 workers, 3 Pinkertons, while dozens more were wounded. When the Pinkertons finally surrendered, the workers beat and humiliated them before marching the bloodied survivors through the town. Newspapers across the nation reported the violence with horror. The New York Times declared Homestead a civil war, and at the center of the storm stood Henry Clay Frick. The strike did not end with that battle. Days later, the Pennsylvania governor dispatched 8,000 state militia troops to restore order. Their arrival crushed the workers' resistance. The mill reopened with non-union labor. The union collapsed. And Frick, unwavering even as bodies were buried, became the most despised man in America. Crowds burned him in effigy. Editorials condemned his cruelty. Politicians denounced his brutality. But none of this swayed him. To Frick, workers had challenged the hierarchy of industry, and he had answered. What happened next shocked the nation even more. On July 23rd, a 25-year-old anarchist named Alexander Berkman walked into Frick's Pittsburgh office disguised as a business visitor. Without hesitation, he pulled a revolver and shot Frick twice in the neck. As the steel magnate collapsed, Berkman lunged forward and stabbed him repeatedly with a sharpened file. Blood pooled across Frick's carpet. Yet somehow, Frick wrestled his attacker to the ground long enough for employees to intervene. He was rushed to the doctor, the bullets removed, the wounds stitched, and the next morning, astonishingly, Frick returned to his desk to resume work. To his admirers, this act became mythic proof of steel-willed fortitude. To his enemies, it confirmed the terrifying resilience of a man who seemed impossible to kill. But to Frick himself, the assassination attempt was a revelation. He had always known he was hated. Now he knew he was hunted. The lesson carved into his skin that day would shape every architectural decision he made for the rest of his life. Wealth attracts enemies, and homes must be fortresses. The timing of this attack coincided directly with Frick's plans for Clayton, his first great mansion under construction in Pittsburgh. After Homestead, the decorative aspects of architecture took a back seat to security. Clayton would not be merely handsome, it would be defensible. Solid masonry walls, minimized ground-level windows, and strategic sightlines were incorporated discreetly into the design. To guests, Clayton appeared elegant. To Frick, it was protection. As he reviewed floor plans, he no longer asked only about beauty or comfort. He asked how quickly doors could be locked, how far windows sat from the street, and whether the house could withstand intruders. The Homestead Strike also altered Frick on a deeper, less visible level. While Andrew Carnegie fled to Scotland during the crisis, attempting to distance himself from the brutality, Frick remained in Pittsburgh, absorbing public hatred with unflinching calm. The divide between the two men widened irreparably. Carnegie, ever sensitive to public opinion, blamed Frick for the disaster. Frick blamed Carnegie for abandoning him. Their partnership survived on paper for a few more years, but trust had been severed. And for Frick, the betrayal was a lesson. People were temporary. Structures were not. If he wanted permanence, not just financial, but historical, he would need to build it himself. By the end of 1892, Frick's public image hardened into something almost mythological. The iron magnate who crushed unions without remorse, survived assassination, and carried on as though bullets were mere inconvenience. And instead of softening his reputation through philanthropy or public speeches, he turned to architecture. The anger of the masses meant little to him. Applause meant even less. What he desired was evidence: stone, steel, gardens, galleries, that he had not only risen but secured his place no matter who despised him. The Homestead Strike did not slow Frick's ambition. It accelerated it. The violence eliminated labor costs, making the mills more profitable than ever. And with revenue soaring, Frick began envisioning not just one residence, but a trio of grand estates that would define the narrative he wanted to leave behind. Pittsburgh would see his first fortress. Newport would see his transformation into an aspiring social figure. And New York, his ultimate stage, would receive a palace designed to outlast scandal, hatred, and even history itself. Homestead was the crucible that forged Frick's architectural philosophy. He learned that power built without security was fragile. That reputation could be rewritten, and that stone could speak louder than any newspaper headline. The blood spilled on that riverbank flowed, in a very real sense, into the foundations of every mansion he would build. And as he moved forward, leaving Homestead behind, Frick did not seek redemption. He sought endurance. His homes would not apologize for him. They would outlive the outrage. In the same year that Homestead exploded into national headlines, Henry Clay Frick quietly purchased a plot of land along 5700 Penn Avenue in Pittsburgh's elite East End. The location was deliberate. The street was lined with the estates of doctors, lawyers, railroad barons, and bankers, the city's social establishment. By placing his new home there, Frick wasn't just upgrading his living conditions. He was planting a flag. This was not the home of a coke magnate. This was a statement of permanence, and it would become the prototype for the architectural philosophy that would define the rest of his life. Power housed in stone, grief hidden in wallpaper, and wealth converted into legacy. The architect Frick selected for Clayton was Frederick John Osterling, a local designer known for his affinity with the Richardsonian Romanesque style. It was the perfect match. Richardsonian Romanesque was heavy, dominant, almost militaristic. Thick limestone walls, semicircular arches, asymmetrical towers. It suggested fortresses, not farmhouses. Churches and public libraries had adopted the style to communicate strength and virtue. For Frick, it became a way to signal dominance. Clayton would not be a showpiece in the French or Italian tradition. It would be an American castle in the heart of Pittsburgh. The materials were carefully chosen to convey timelessness. Indiana limestone and deep red brick clad the structure, replacing the common wood siding of the era with something much more permanent. The house stretched across 4 floors and contained 23 rooms, not extravagant compared to the excesses of Newport or Fifth Avenue, but substantial for Pittsburgh. Every room, every corridor, every stairwell was considered. Frick had little interest in flamboyance, but absolute insistence on quality. This was not about gilding ceilings. It was about building something that would never need to be replaced. The first floor of Clayton served as the theater of Frick's public identity. A large entrance hall greeted guests, not with chandeliers or mirrors, but with dark wood paneling, a wide staircase, and an air of unshakable seriousness. The message was simple: This house belongs to someone important. Adjacent sat the library, a room built less for reading than for suggesting that its owner was cultured. And then the dining room, large, formal, and able to seat 24 guests. Businessmen, visiting dignitaries, and social climbers all passed through this space, surrounded by imported furnishings and carefully selected paintings that said as much about ambition as they did about taste. Upstairs, the house softened. The second floor was where Adelaide Frick reigned. It held the couple's bedrooms, their children's rooms, and private family spaces. Here, her influence is unmistakable. Where Frick obsessed over durability and symbolism, Adelaide cared for function and warmth. She selected fabrics, arranged floral patterns, and organized a social calendar that could put even the most traditional hostesses to shame. Clayton became a machine for both public image and domestic order, and Adelaide was its chief engineer behind closed doors. The third floor held servants' quarters. The fourth, located in the tower, served as Frick's personal retreat, a private chamber, away from the staff and even his family, where he conducted business too delicate for his office downtown. It was a house of zones, public, private, and secret. And in that layout, we begin to understand something deeper about Frick. He was not merely building a home. He was constructing an architecture of control. And yet, even within this fortress of order and strength, tragedy seeped through the seams. The Fricks had 4 children, but only 2 would survive to adulthood. In 1891, their eldest daughter, Martha, died of a mysterious illness at just 6 years old. Her loss devastated Adelaide. She withdrew from social life, spending hours in the gardens or locked inside Martha's bedroom, which remained untouched for years. 7 years later, their son Henry Jr. died at the age of 4. This second loss struck even deeper. In a world where Frick had conquered business, crushed unions, and survived assassination, he could do nothing to protect his own children from death. Clayton absorbed these losses like the stone walls it was built from. Beneath the public grandeur, the house became a place of mourning. The garden paths Adelaide walked in silence. The sunroom where Martha had once played. The window seats where Henry Jr. had curled up with books. These details, never listed in architectural plans, became permanent features in the emotional geography of the home. Clayton was not just a fortress. It became a mausoleum of memory. Frick himself was changed by these tragedies, though he expressed it in ways only architecture could reveal. He doubled down on permanence, began acquiring art with obsessive focus, and funneled more energy into designing residences where time could be controlled, even if life could not. The house at Clayton, built to assert strength, now had to hold sorrow. Its stone walls bore not only the weight of wealth, but the silence of grief. The gardens became especially important. Covering nearly 2 acres, the grounds included a greenhouse that became Adelaide's personal domain. She filled it with orchids, ferns, and seasonal flowers, ensuring that fresh bouquets adorned every room, even in the depths of winter. It was a gesture of control over time and decay, a daily defiance of death. Frick indulged her this sanctuary. He understood that for all his hardness, the woman who managed his household and softened his image needed beauty she could command. By 1895, Clayton was complete. It had cost over $500,000, equivalent to more than $17 million today. For Pittsburgh, it was an extraordinary sum. For Frick, it was the foundation, Clayton accomplished what it was meant to do. It placed Frick among the city's elite, established him as a serious architectural patron, and proved that his wealth could buy not just influence, but legitimacy. And yet, legitimacy in Pittsburgh would always come with a shadow. This was the city of Homestead. The newspapers that covered his triumphs also remembered the dead. His office still bore the scars of Berkman's bullets. In the parlors of polite society, Frick's name invoked admiration, but never affection. Clayton could not erase what Pittsburgh knew. It could only dress it in imported wallpaper and burnished oak. And perhaps that realization is what prompted Frick to think beyond the city that had made him. Pittsburgh had given him his fortune, but it would never give him forgiveness. His past loomed too large. His actions had been too public. If he wanted to be remembered differently, it would have to happen elsewhere. In Newport, perhaps. Among those who only cared that you summered in the right zip code. Or better yet, in New York, where legacy could be shaped by limestone and oil paint rather than memory. Clayton, for all its complexity, was only the first chapter. It was the house where Frick built his foundation and buried his grief. It was a mansion of strategy and sorrow, public posture and private pain. And it taught him a critical lesson. Architecture could define a man's reputation, but only if built in the right place. He would not make that mistake again. By the late 1890s, Henry Clay Frick had cemented his dominance over industry and Pittsburgh society. But that was not enough. His mind had turned to the next frontier. Legitimacy among America's coastal elite. He understood what his peers in steel and rail had long known. True power wasn't measured solely by balance sheets or factory output, but by proximity to the old families who defined the social calendar. And there was only one place where the boundaries of wealth and class collided each summer in a glittering, cutthroat theater of manors and mansions. Newport, Rhode Island. In 1899, Frick acquired a parcel of land on the edge of Newport, in a quieter section called Pride's Crossing. The location was revealing. Rather than build directly on Bellevue Avenue, where Gilded Age excess towered in limestone and marble, he chose something more secluded, more private. It wasn't an act of modesty, it was an act of control. He didn't want to compete with the ostentatious Vanderbilt palaces. He wanted to cultivate something more refined, something that blended exclusivity with a whisper of restraint. He named the estate Eagle Rock. Eagle Rock was not small. It contained over 30 rooms, covered more than 10 acres, and was outfitted with the kind of amenities expected by anyone hoping to break into the East Coast's tightly gated social sphere. But its architectural style stood in quiet defiance of the flamboyance around it. Frick hired the esteemed Boston firm Peabody and Stearns, known for their elegant but conservative designs. They opted for the shingle style, popular among the upper class for its evocation of English country houses, rich in detail, but stripped of the gaudiness that defined French-inspired Newport giants like the Breakers. The mansion's long, sloping roofs, wide porches, and understated wooden facades gave it a warmth that Clayton lacked. This was by design. Frick wanted to appear sophisticated, not showy. Yet inside, the house was no less luxurious than its marble-clad neighbors. The rooms were large, well-proportioned, and filled with expensive art and imported furniture. But where Clayton had been formal and defensive, Eagle Rock was curated for ease and entertaining. It had to be. Newport was a stage, and every gathering, luncheon, and garden stroll was an audition for inclusion in the country's most exclusive circles. Adelaide Frick came into her own at Eagle Rock. In Pittsburgh, her presence was essential but secondary to Henry's business persona. In Newport, she became the social general. She understood the rules, unspoken, inherited, rigid. Who could be invited? Who could be seated next to whom? Which days were reserved for calling? Which families hosted which annual events? Her background, while not quite old money, gave her enough fluency in etiquette to play the part convincingly. She orchestrated dinner parties with military precision and turned Eagle Rock into a hub of selective hospitality. The grounds played a vital role in this transformation. Frick commissioned landscape architects to design a network of formal gardens, winding paths, and open lawns. The estate's natural beauty was heightened with carefully manicured spaces that looked effortless but were meticulously maintained. Guests could wander past rose-covered trellises, rest beneath elms, or stroll along gravel paths that opened to sweeping views of the Atlantic. It was all meant to feel like paradise, curated by someone who belonged. But belonging was always just out of reach. Despite the grandeur of Eagle Rock, Frick was never fully accepted into Newport's innermost circles. The old money families, those with pre-Civil War lineage and names that adorned Harvard libraries, tolerated him. They admired his collection, attended his parties, and acknowledged his taste. But they never forgot Homestead. They never forgot the Pinkertons, the blood, or the fact that he was not one of them. To them, Frick was a man who had come into the room with the right clothes but the wrong origin story. Still, Eagle Rock served its purpose. It gave the Fricks access. It allowed their children, Helen and Childs, to grow up around names like Astor, Whitney, and Vanderbilt. It gave Adelaide a canvas to perform social artistry, and it gave Henry a front-row seat to the elite customs he would later imitate and quietly subvert in New York. More than anything, it gave him time. Summers at Eagle Rock were peaceful. He still conducted business. His library was wired for telegraph communications, but he did so from behind drawn curtains, as ocean breezes carried the scent of wealth and distance. And perhaps most importantly, Eagle Rock taught Frick about architecture's relationship to narrative. Newport mansions were not just homes. They were biographies. Each was a chapter in a family's myth. Rosecliff was a ballroom in stone, Marble House, a marble-clad battle cry. The Elms, a meticulous French replica. Frick watched how these families used architecture to shape perception. Some succeeded. Others became cautionary tales of excess and debt. He took notes. His takeaway was not that grandeur guaranteed immortality. It was that buildings must outlive purpose. A mansion that only functioned as a party venue would be obsolete the moment the party ended. A mansion that held a greater purpose, education, preservation, cultural enrichment, could endure beyond fashion. At Eagle Rock, he began to conceptualize his masterpiece not as a place to live, but as a legacy to leave. 1 East 70th Street would be more than a mansion. It would be a temple. By 1910, the summers at Eagle Rock were winding down. Frick was spending more and more time in New York. His art collection, now one of the most significant in private hands, had begun to outgrow his spaces. He needed more room. More importantly, he needed a place where legacy could be curated as meticulously as the canvases he collected. Eagle Rock had taught him how to mingle with aristocracy, but now he wanted to transcend them. In 1917, Frick sold Eagle Rock. He had used it as a training ground for respectability, as a seasonal fortress of charm, as a strategic outpost in the battle for perception. But it was no longer necessary. The final act of his architectural drama was about to begin, and this time, it wouldn't be summer only. It would be permanent. Fifth Avenue awaited. By 1912, Henry Clay Frick was no longer merely one of America's richest men. He was an institution, a symbol of Gilded Age ambition and controversy. Yet as he approached his mid-60s, he faced a truth that no amount of money could deflect. Time would catch him, and memory would not be kind. Frick knew his reputation was stained with blood. From Homestead, from the Pinkertons, from the ruthless business dealings that had built his empire. He had watched as Carnegie turned to philanthropy and libraries to soften his legacy. Frick's answer would be different. He would not scatter his name across hundreds of buildings. He would concentrate it into one address, one monument, one building that would be beautiful enough to survive the anger of history. That place was 1 East 70th Street. Frick had spent the previous decade renting homes in New York while quietly searching for the ideal plot of land. Location was everything. It had to be grand, but not gaudy, prominent, but not overrun by commercial traffic. In 1913, he found it. A full block front between 70th and 71st Streets on Fifth Avenue, directly across from Central Park. The site was massive by Manhattan standards, 150 feet wide and 200 feet deep. The price was staggering, $2, $45 million, equivalent to over $70 million today, just for the land. But for Frick, it was perfect. It offered privacy, prestige, and the space to construct a building that could do what so many Gilded Age mansions failed to do: endure. Frick had learned from watching others. The Vanderbilt mansions to the south were already looking dated, too ornate, too indulgent, too disconnected from evolving taste. Many had already been demolished or subdivided. Carnegie had built far uptown, at 91st Street. Practical, yes, but socially distant. Frick was deliberate. His mansion would be close enough to remain relevant, but far enough north to avoid the commercial creep swallowing Midtown. And it would not be a temporary display of wealth. It would be a permanent gesture of authority. He hired Carrere and Hastings, the architectural firm behind the New York Public Library, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece. Thomas Hastings took personal charge of the project. From the beginning, both men knew this house was not just for living. It would eventually become a museum. Every detail, every room, every proportion would serve dual purposes: comfort now, culture later. Frick made it clear. He was not building a home. He was building a future institution. The family would live in it, but history would inhabit it. The design Hastings proposed was French neoclassical. Limestone facade, perfect symmetry, restrained elegance. It would not scream for attention. It would draw it slowly, inevitably, with the quiet confidence of architectural mastery. Frick didn't want flamboyant balconies or whimsical turrets. He wanted order, permanence, weight. The kind of building that looked like it had always been there, and always would be. Construction began in 1914. The timing was uncanny. As Europe plunged into the bloodshed of World War I, Frick poured resources into a private palace that seemed to resist the very idea of impermanence. Every material was selected with the highest standard. Indiana limestone, thick, smooth, and durable, was quarried with exacting care. Blocks were rejected if their tone varied slightly from the others. Windows were imported from France. Bronze doors, not just faced in bronze but cast entirely, guarded the entry. The foundation extended 30 feet below the surface, deeper than most commercial buildings, ensuring structural stability for generations. Frick spared no expense because this was not just an architectural project. It was an argument, a statement that he could define beauty, legacy, and culture on his terms. While other magnates relied on publicity or donations to shape how they were remembered, Frick trusted architecture. He believed that if he built something perfect enough, people would forget why they had once hated him. The layout reflected that philosophy. Hastings designed 3 visible floors and a recessed 4th hidden behind a balustrade. The building stretched 140 feet along Fifth Avenue, with a proportional depth and symmetry that evoked classical ideals. Every element was calibrated. The windows, evenly spaced. The cornices, restrained. The overall effect, dignified. Unlike the Vanderbilt mansions that burst with decoration, Frick's mansion breathed. It did not shout. It stood in quiet certainty. Frick's vision extended beyond structure. Inside, he wanted rooms that would display his growing art collection with the reverence of a European gallery. He commissioned Hastings to design spaces like the West Gallery, the library, and the living hall with this duality in mind. These were rooms built for intimate gatherings, but with the scale and proportions suitable for Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Turner. Natural light was introduced through skylights and garden courtyards, and walls were finished in damask or paneling that would flatter gold-framed masterpieces. Security, too, was paramount. Frick had not forgotten Berkman's bullets or the vitriol stirred during Homestead. While the mansion's exterior conveyed elegance, its core was fortified. Ground-floor windows were smaller than they appeared, recessed into thick stone. Locks, hinges, and doors were state-of-the-art. Entrances could be sealed quickly. Vaults and fireproof storage rooms were hidden throughout. No part of the building lacked purpose. The mansion's future was already mapped out in Frick's mind. Adelaide would live there as long as she wished. But when she passed, the building would transform. It would not be auctioned or demolished or partitioned. It would become the Frick Collection, not a cold institution, but a living memory housed in limestone and oil paint. A space where his name would survive not through legend or myth, but through walls that bore witness to beauty. Unlike his contemporaries, Frick didn't build to impress dinner guests or host grand balls. He built to influence the future. He studied how private homes failed to transition into institutions. Most were too grand, too specific, too impractical. He wanted rooms that could be preserved with minimal alteration, that already functioned as galleries, salons, reading rooms. He didn't want his home converted. He wanted it unveiled, in many ways. 1 East 70th was the answer to Clayton's limitations and Eagle Rock's pretensions. It was built in the heart of a city that defined culture, yet set apart just enough to remain timeless. It was built from the same principles as his earlier homes: control, durability, hierarchy, but refined through experience and obsession. And most importantly, it was built not to prove Frick belonged in society, but to ensure he outlived it. By late 1915, the exterior was complete. The interiors would take several more years, but even as construction continued, the mansion was already becoming legend. Neighbors whispered about its elegance. Architectural critics praised its classical restraint. And Frick, now in his late 60s, visited the site regularly, measuring, inspecting, demanding corrections. This building would be his final act, his rebuttal to scandal, his masterpiece, his bet that beauty could outlast memory. As the scaffolding rose and limestone blocks began to settle into place on the corner of Fifth Avenue and East 70th Street, New York watched with curiosity. The year was 1914, and while war was breaking out across Europe, Henry Clay Frick was orchestrating a different kind of battle, one against time, mediocrity, and public perception. For him, this was not just a house. It was a legacy factory, a monument under construction. Every stone laid was an act of control. Every decision, a message. And the message was simple. This house would last. Not just through fashion or fortune, but through centuries. Frick chose the George A. Fuller Company to manage construction, a firm renowned for its precision and discipline. They had built the Flatiron Building and countless other structures that defined the city's silhouette. But even they had never encountered a client like Frick. His demands were relentless. No margin for imperfection. No tolerance for shortcuts. He was present, often in person, inspecting stonework, measuring window joints, running his fingers across wood panels to detect flaws the eye might miss. Perfection wasn't the goal. It was the standard. The limestone came from Indiana, the same source used for the exterior of Clayton decades earlier, but this time, it was selected with even greater scrutiny. Frick rejected roughly 15% of the stone delivered to the site, an astounding figure that infuriated suppliers but ensured absolute visual consistency. He was not building an illusion of grandeur. He was building substance. The blocks were cut with surgical precision. Joints between them were barely visible. The house appeared carved, not assembled. Beneath the elegant limestone lay an interior skeleton of over-engineered steel. The frame was built to commercial standards, far exceeding what was necessary for a residence. The basement went down 30 feet and included state-of-the-art mechanical systems, boilers, generators, wine cellars, and vaults. Frick demanded redundancy. Every system had a backup, every corridor, a purpose. He had learned from earlier projects. Buildings should not merely look durable, they had to function across time, adapt to use, and survive unforeseen events. The windows were custom-made in France, bronze-framed, triple-glazed in select rooms for insulation and soundproofing. Frick insisted that visitors inside the mansion should not hear the chaos of Fifth Avenue. They should hear silence, or perhaps music, but never traffic. The bronze elements weren't decorative veneers. They were solid, weighty, and symbolic. Bronze ages. It oxidizes with dignity. It does not rot. It does not lie. Frick's obsession extended to the roof. Most of his contemporaries opted for slate or tile, functional but uninspired. Frick selected copper. It would oxidize into a soft green over time, complementing the limestone with a color that whispered rather than shouted. Copper, he understood, didn't just last. It aged beautifully. That was the goal for the entire mansion, not to remain frozen in time, but to mature with it. Security was integrated invisibly, but decisively. The ground floor windows were designed with deep reveals, creating a visual illusion of large openings while reducing the risk of entry. Locks and hinges were the best available, sourced from Yale and town. Internal doors were reinforced with steel cores wrapped in oak or mahogany. Safe rooms were hidden behind paneling. Art storage was fireproof and climate-controlled. Frick had not forgotten the gunshots in his Pittsburgh office. He had not forgotten being stabbed, bleeding onto his desk while refusing to leave for the hospital. The man who survived assassination did not build houses that invited it. The layout was shaped by dual purposes: public rooms, the West Gallery, the living hall, the dining room, were given grandeur and scale, with ceilings that reached 19 feet and proportions based on Renaissance ideals. But private spaces were smaller, more comfortable. Hastings designed transitions between rooms with subtle elevation changes and controlled sightlines. Every corridor and threshold created deliberate shifts in atmosphere. You felt when you left the public world and entered the private one. Even mechanical systems, plumbing, heating, electrical, were state-of-the-art. The heating system used radiators hidden behind architectural screens, ensuring that comfort never interrupted aesthetic cohesion. Wiring for electricity was embedded discreetly, with outlets positioned to avoid visual disruption. Switch plates were cast in bronze to match the door hardware. It wasn't enough for the house to work. It had to work invisibly. The garden court, though not completed during Frick's lifetime, was part of Hastings's original design and received foundational preparation during construction. It would bring natural light into the mansion's core, acting as both a sanctuary and a visual centerpiece. This was another layer of Frick's legacy planning. He didn't just want art on the walls. He wanted the building itself to be a work of art. Light, space, silence, and structure balanced like a Rembrandt composition. The proportions of the facade were mathematically precise. Every window aligned with architectural rhythms. The entrance, centered and flanked by columns, was grand but not ostentatious. There was no portico or double stair like the Vanderbilt homes. Just a single bronze door, one entrance, one message. You do not wander into this place. You are invited. The Fifth Avenue facade was echoed on the side streets. There were no unfinished surfaces, no cost-saving shortcuts on secondary elevations. The same limestone, the same precision, the same dignity wrapped around the entire structure. Even the wall enclosing the garden was built from cut stone, capped with bronze railings. For Frick, there were no less important sides of the building. Every inch was memory-proofed. Interior work accelerated by 1916. By now, Frick was nearly 70. He visited the site almost daily. His health was beginning to falter, but his intensity never dimmed. He corrected contractors, negotiated with suppliers, and worked closely with Hastings to approve final details. He selected paintings for each wall, often choosing frames before the rooms were even painted. The mansion was his final gamble, his theory in stone, his message to the future. And the message was this: reputation fades, wealth fluctuates, power is temporary, but beauty, executed with discipline, grounded in permanence, can outlast everything. The Homestead Strike, the blood in the river, the anarchist's bullet, none of that could be erased, but it could be outshone. If he got it right, the world would forget the violence and remember the paintings, forget the strikes and remember the skylights. Frick was building not just to be remembered, but to be remembered differently. And in the echoes of chisels and the grinding of stone, his wager was clear. When the critics returned, when history reopened the file on Henry Clay Frick, they wouldn't begin with outrage. They'd begin at the front door of 1 East 70th Street. When visitors stepped through the bronze front door of 1 East 70th Street for the first time, they didn't enter a house. They entered a vision. For Henry Clay Frick, The interior of his Fifth Avenue mansion was not merely a reflection of wealth, but a carefully staged experience. Every room was an act in a theatrical production meant to shape how people saw him, remembered him, and ultimately judged him. The mansion may have been labeled a private residence, but from the beginning, it was constructed to operate like a museum, and in doing so, Frick created something extraordinary, a home that quietly prepared to become eternal. The entrance hall set the tone immediately. Unlike the grand, double-height vestibules found in many Gilded Age homes, Frick's entry space was restrained and deliberate. Marble floors gleamed under soft, natural light from a skylight above, while walls of pale limestone provided calm and weight. There was no overwhelming staircase or chandelier to announce arrival. The room instead invited stillness, composure, and attention. You were not there to be dazzled. You were there to observe. From the entrance hall, the mansion unfolded like a gallery. The West Gallery itself, stretching nearly 70 feet along the western wall, was the crown jewel. Designed with proportions specific to oil paintings, the room featured nearly 20-foot ceilings and controlled natural light. A skylight, softened with translucent glass and augmented by adjustable electric lighting, allowed Frick's collection to be seen as it would have been in European salons. The walls, covered in warm rose-colored damask, served as a quiet backdrop that made the gold leaf frames sing. Rembrandt, Vermeer, El Greco, Van Dyck. The gallery was less an act of display and more a confession of obsession. Benches upholstered in matching tones invited long moments of contemplation. The polished, dark oak floors reflected light and movement with subtle grace. Every architectural detail faded into function. The room did not announce its luxury. It revealed it slowly, deliberately, like a painting coming into focus over time. Elsewhere, the mansion continued its careful choreography. The living hall, the heart of the house, combined Renaissance furniture, French tapestries, and carefully curated paintings in a space that could accommodate both a quiet afternoon and a formal reception. It was a hybrid, a private drawing room designed to operate, when needed, as a public salon. A massive pipe organ, a must-have for homes of this scale, occupied one wall, not because Frick loved music, he didn't, but because society expected it. In this house, expectations were anticipated, then elevated. The library, perhaps Frick's most personal space, sat at the southern end of the mansion overlooking the garden court. Clad in English oak paneling with a marble fireplace and a coffered ceiling painted in subdued tones, the room was both elegant and functional. It held not only rare books, but also documents, ledgers, and private correspondence. Frick used it for solitude, strategy, and reflection. It was here, late in his life, that he often sat and reread letters, reports, and acquisitions lists, crafting not just a collection, but an identity. The dining room offered another kind of experience. While not oversized, it seated 14 comfortably, with space to expand for larger occasions. The table was solid English oak. The chairs were needle-pointed in custom designs selected by Adelaide. On the walls hung portraits and still lifes, tastefully lit, but never overpowering. Frick did not believe in spectacle for its own sake. Meals were moments of control, and the room reflected that balance. Rich without being gaudy, noble without being cold. Upstairs, the second floor was entirely private. The family's quarters were not built to impress visitors. They were built to serve as sanctuary. Frick's suite occupied the southwest corner. Large windows faced the park and the garden court, providing soft light and an illusion of nature amidst urban density. His bedroom was spare, decorated with precision rather than opulence. His bathroom was fully plumbed, outfitted with the finest fixtures available. The dressing room included built-in cabinetry with lined drawers and compartments for personal effects, because disorder was never acceptable. Adelaide's suite mirrored her husband's on the northern end. Her rooms were warmer in tone, decorated with floral fabrics, French furniture, and delicate touches that softened the building's formality. She had her own private sitting room, where she managed correspondence, staff schedules, and social obligations. The couple maintained parallel but distinct lives in the house, connected by shared spaces and common rituals. Guest rooms, scattered across the second and third floors, were individually decorated. Each included a writing desk, a fireplace, and curated furnishings. These were not generic suites. They were respectful accommodations for a very specific circle of guests: art dealers, business allies, and the occasional visiting family member. Beyond these lived the staff, but even their quarters were considered. Located primarily on the third and recessed fourth floors, servants had private staircases, narrow corridors, and separate access routes that allowed them to maintain the illusion of an invisible household. The mechanical and service infrastructure was hidden but revolutionary. Heating was provided through radiators placed behind custom grills. The electrical system, designed with input from Edison's engineers, allowed light levels to be finely controlled. Wall switches were cast in bronze, shaped and placed to blend into paneling and wainscoting. Plumbing was pressurized and filtered. The entire house could function for months without needing external repair. It was a self-contained monument, and at its center sat the yet-to-be-completed garden court, a space Frick would not live to see finished, but envisioned from the very beginning. Designed as a covered atrium filled with plants, marble, and light, it would eventually tie the house together, physically and symbolically. It brought nature indoors. It softened the limestone. It allowed the collection to breathe, and in doing so, it gave the house a heart. More than a residence. 1 East 70th was a living thesis. Frick's vision, executed with obsessive detail, was to build a space where public legacy and private life could coexist. Unlike other mansions that simply added a gallery wing or converted ballrooms into exhibition halls, Frick's house had been designed from day one to transform. The proportions of the rooms, the structural integrity, the flow of light, the durability of materials, all pointed toward one purpose: future preservation. It was also intensely personal. The paintings were not randomly acquired trophies. Each was selected by Frick, sometimes over years, sometimes after dramatic negotiations. They were not decorations. They were statements. Statements about taste, about refinement, about a man who came from soot and barbed wire and built a home that made the Metropolitan Museum feel cavernous by comparison. In 1919, as the family prepared to finally move in, the interior was nearly complete. The mansion had taken over 5 years and cost more than $5 million, a staggering sum at the time. Frick had invested not just his money, but his identity. He had curated his image in wood, stone, and canvas, and for a few short months, he would live in the space he had so meticulously imagined, the culmination of a life defined by precision. But he knew it would not be his for long. He wasn't building for the now. he was building for the afterward. In the early 20th century, Fifth Avenue was more than a boulevard. It was a battleground of architectural ambition. Stretching from Midtown to the Upper East Side, the avenue was lined with the palaces of America's industrial elite. Every block told a story of dynastic wealth and social climbing. Marble facades, wrought iron gates, Italianate towers. Each mansion competed for prominence in a game where appearances were everything. But what few of these titanic homes achieved, endurance, Frick's house at 1 East 70th Street did. And that, more than the Rembrandts or rose-colored damask, is what makes the Frick mansion unique. It survived. To understand just how radical that survival is, we must look at what came before and what fell after. The Vanderbilt family had built an empire of mansions farther south. William Henry Vanderbilt constructed a colossal double mansion at 5th Avenue and 51st Street in the 1880s. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the largest private home ever constructed in New York, a sprawling 130-room French chateau at 57th and 5th. It occupied an entire block. And yet, within decades, both homes were gone, demolished, replaced by commercial towers and luxury retailers. The grandeur that once defined them proved fragile in the face of shifting economics and changing tastes. Then there were the Astors. Their mansions had dominated the area around 34th Street, until commercial creep swallowed them whole. Even their symbolic claim to American aristocracy couldn't shield their homes from the wrecking ball. As Midtown grew into a commercial hub, real estate pressure turned Fifth Avenue from residential paradise into business corridor. Department stores, hotels, and office towers replaced drawing rooms and garden courts. The land beneath the mansions was simply worth more than the buildings atop it. Andrew Carnegie, Frick's old partner and rival, took a different approach. He built his own mansion in 1903, but he did so at 91st Street, farther north, where land was cheaper and development less intense. His residence was elegant, designed with practicality in mind, and built for longevity. It still stands today as the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. But while Carnegie's home was a respectable example of Gilded Age architecture, it lacked the ambition and centrality of Frick's Fifth Avenue masterpiece. Frick studied all of this. He was obsessed not just with art and architecture, but with permanence. He recognized what so many of his peers failed to grasp. Scale alone does not guarantee survival. Excess becomes burden. Grandeur becomes grotesque. And a mansion built for show becomes obsolete the moment the show ends. Frick, ever the strategist, planned his home differently. He understood that buildings which serve public purposes are protected in ways private residences can never be. His mansion was never meant to be just a house. From the start, it was a hybrid, a private palace and a public institution in waiting. This duality gave it a future. While the Vanderbilt mansions were too large to maintain, too personalized to convert, and too inflexible to adapt. Frick's house was the opposite. Its size was commanding but manageable. Its structure was museum-ready. Its location, central but not yet overrun. And its design, timeless, elegant, restrained, meant it would not fall out of favor like the Baroque castles down the street. Frick also chose the right moment. By the time the Great Demolition Wave swept through Manhattan in the 1920s and 30s, he was already dead, but his building was protected by purpose. In his will, he stipulated that the mansion would become a museum after Adelaide's death, supported by an endowment to ensure its financial independence. This endowment was not symbolic. It was robust, designed to weather depressions, changes in taste, and the erosion of inherited wealth that dismantled so many other Gilded Age legacies. Architecturally, the mansion's adaptability was key. Carrere and Hastings had designed a home that was not merely beautiful, but rational. The rooms were proportioned for human use. Galleries were spacious, but not cavernous. Circulation flowed naturally. The spaces could accommodate paintings, visitors, docents, and curators without needing structural overhaul. When compared to the Vanderbilt galleries, awkwardly repurposed ballrooms filled with decorative excess, the Frick interiors were almost surgical in their precision. Moreover, Frick's mansion avoided the aesthetic traps that doomed its neighbors. Where others embraced the flamboyance of the French Renaissance or the clutter of Italianate revival, Frick chose classical restraint. Neoclassicism, rooted in Greek and Roman proportion, has a built-in immunity to fashion. It is not timeless because it ignores time. It is timeless because it references centuries of beauty that have already survived. And then there's the matter of scale. Frick's mansion was large, about 30 major rooms, but it was not absurd. It required a household staff. Yes, but not an army. Its annual maintenance costs were high, but sustainable. This practicality gave it resilience. As other homes became financial liabilities, Frick's mansion remained viable. As fortunes waned and heirs lost interest, the Frick estate endured. In the 1920s and 30s, as Fifth Avenue's architectural landscape collapsed around it, Frick's mansion stood unshaken. The Whitney mansion became apartments. The Havemeyers disappeared. The Gould residence was bulldozed. Each one, once hailed as architectural triumphs, vanished under the weight of irrelevance and real estate pressure. And yet, nestled between 70th and 71st, facing Central Park with quiet assurance, Frick's house remained. Even critics took notice. As early as 1925, architectural writers were describing the Frick as a model for preservation. It was cited in lectures, studied in design schools, admired by museum directors, and this was before it even opened to the public. Its endurance wasn't accidental. It was the product of vision, executed with discipline. Today, the mansion stands as one of the only fully intact Gilded Age residences on Fifth Avenue. It has not been gutted. It has not been compromised. Its facade, galleries, and even original furniture remain meticulously maintained. Where tourists pass Tiffany & Co. and Louis Vuitton storefronts without a second glance, they pause in front of the Frick. They look up at the limestone walls, the wrought iron gates, the manicured hedges, and they see not a relic, but a survivor. Frick's ultimate lesson to his peers was this: if you want your mansion to last, do not build it just for yourself. Build it for the world, but make sure it's beautiful enough that the world wants to keep it. When Henry Clay Frick died on December 2nd, 1919, he left behind more than a fortune. He left behind a blueprint for immortality, enshrined not in steel or shares, but in stone. In his will, he stipulated that his mansion at 1 East 70th Street would, eventually, become a public museum, but not immediately. First, it would remain what it had been in the final months of his life, a private home. His widow, Adelaide, was granted full use of the residence for as long as she lived. Only after her death could the transformation begin. Adelaide, then 61, did not alter the house. She preserved it. For 12 years, she lived quietly within its walls, surrounded by her husband's collection, maintaining the spaces as they had been during his lifetime. The dining room remained set for formal meals. The West Gallery continued to display the Rembrandts and Turners in their original positions. Even the scent of cut flowers, so carefully arranged during Frick's life, still filled the rooms. Replenished by the staff Adelaide oversaw with quiet precision. Her stewardship of the mansion was more than custodial, it was devotional. But she also understood the future her husband had envisioned. And in 1921, she authorized the first significant step toward that future. She hired architect John Russell Pope, already celebrated for his classical sensibilities, to design an addition that would enclose the central courtyard, transforming it into what would become the garden court. This project was more than an architectural modification. It was a bridge between the mansion's private past and its public destiny. Pope's addition was respectful of Thomas Hastings's original design, yet distinct. He created a columned atrium covered with a skylight, surrounding a central fountain and carefully chosen plantings. The effect was serene and luminous, a space where visitors could pause between galleries and absorb the weight of beauty. The garden court became a signature of the new Frick collection. It softened the mansion's austerity and made the transition from home to museum feel inevitable. By the time Adelaide died in 1931, the transformation was already underway, architecturally and psychologically. Her passing unlocked the legal trigger in Frick's will. Now, the trustees of his estate could proceed with the most delicate operation of all, turning one of New York's finest private homes into one of its most treasured public institutions. But this was no ordinary era. The United States was in the grip of the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed. Soup kitchens stretched for blocks. And now, a museum dedicated to the tastes of a titan, once reviled for his treatment of labor, was about to open its doors. The trustees proceeded with caution. Frick's endowment, wisely invested and managed, allowed the institution to be financially independent even in hard times. There was no need for public fundraising, no urgent search for donors. That independence allowed them to maintain control over the mansion's integrity. No banners were hung. No modern signage cluttered the entrance. The house would remain a house, its soul untouched. Renovations were minimal. The second floor's private family quarters were converted into administrative offices. The first floor remained almost entirely unchanged. The garden court served as the public entry point, while the West Gallery, library, and living hall became the core exhibition spaces. Visitors could now walk through the same rooms where Frick had dined, collected, and mused about posterity, rooms that looked and felt as they had during his life. In December 1935, the Frick collection officially opened to the public. Admission was free. Reservations were required, not to build exclusivity, but to protect the building from overcrowding. And then the public came, curious, skeptical, and ultimately captivated. They saw not just a museum, but a preserved moment in time. The house did not feel converted. It felt continuous, as if Frick had simply stepped out and would return at any moment. Critics praised the experience. The New York Times marveled at the intimacy of the collection. Art historians lauded the coherence of the space. In contrast to the sprawling, encyclopedic halls of the Metropolitan Museum, the Frick offered quiet. A visitor could spend an afternoon in one room and never feel hurried. The paintings felt more human, more present. You weren't walking through a museum. You were visiting someone's home, someone with remarkable taste, vast resources, and a clear vision of what art could become in the right context. Over the following decades, the Frick collection's reputation grew. Acquisitions were carefully selected to complement the original holdings, but the core of the museum always remained Frick's personal choices. Every new curator was, in a sense, stepping into a houseguest role, welcomed, but never allowed to rearrange the furniture too freely. The mansion's unique hybrid identity required constant balance. It was both museum and monument, both home and institution. Expansion was always controversial. Preservationists feared compromise. Administrators wrestled with space constraints. But the essential experience remained unchanged. To walk into the Frick was to enter a vision frozen in marble and oil, a space that offered, in its silence and elegance, a version of Henry Clay Frick that the labor wars could not quite destroy. Even Frick's daughter, Helen Clay Frick, maintained a fierce guardianship over her father's legacy. Though she never lived in the mansion after Adelaide's death, she remained deeply involved with the museum's development. She scrutinized acquisitions, oversaw staff, and pushed back against any suggestion that might dilute her father's original intent. Her influence helped preserve the mansion's character, and her refusal to compromise ensured that the institution's identity stayed rooted in its founder's peculiar blend of refinement and ruthlessness. As years passed, New York changed around the mansion. Glass towers rose, traffic thickened, tastes evolved. But the Frick collection, with its Venetian chairs and damask-covered walls, stayed the same. It didn't expand aggressively. It didn't brand itself loudly. It didn't chase trends. It simply remained what it was, a house of art, a temple of control, and a memory carefully preserved in limestone. Frick had gambled that architecture could rewrite memory, that beauty could soften brutality, that the same man who ordered barbed wire around Homestead could be remembered for brushstrokes and balance. And the slow transformation from private palace to public museum proved that, at least in part, he was right. The Frick collection wasn't just a success, it was a vindication. In a city that devoured its past in the name of progress, Frick had built something that stood still, and in doing so, he had made sure that even if people forgot the pain he caused, they would never forget the place he built. Walk down Fifth Avenue today and you'll pass gleaming storefronts, polished stone facades, and a constant hum of wealth in motion. But then, between 70th and 71st Street, the tone changes. The sidewalks quiet, the trees open, and there, in solemn contrast to the glass towers and designer boutiques, stands a building that refuses to be forgotten. The Frick collection. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Because what it represents, power turned to culture, brutality turned to beauty, has already been written in stone. The mansion at 1 East 70th Street is more than just an architectural artifact. It is a paradox, a mirror held up to America's Gilded Age and its aftermath. It asks, without ever speaking aloud, can a house redeem a man? Can a building outlive a reputation? And more unsettling still, does beauty built on injustice become any less beautiful? Henry Clay Frick believed the answer was yes, that by commissioning one of the most elegant private homes in the country and filling it with world-class art, he could refashion his story. Not erase it, Frick was too pragmatic for illusions, but rewrite it in a different key. He knew that people remember what they can see and touch, that over time, paintings speak louder than headlines, columns stand longer than criticism, and walls, if built thick enough, can muffle the sound of protest. Frick's contemporaries built with speed and spectacle. He built with patience and permanence. The difference is visible today. While the Vanderbilt mansions have vanished, while the Astors are now footnotes, Frick's vision still stands, not just as a building, but as an institution, alive, functioning, and revered. His gamble on longevity paid off. The museum draws over 300,000 visitors annually. His name, once tied to gunfire and barbed wire, is now spoken in the same breath as Vermeer and Velázquez. But the irony runs deeper. The very collection that softens Frick's public image was purchased with profits extracted from the bodies and lives of the laborers he crushed. Every masterpiece hung on those damask-covered walls represents not just taste, but cost, human cost. The workers at Homestead who labored in searing heat, the families who survived on starvation wages, the Union men who died on the banks of the Monongahela, none of their names hang in gilded frames. And yet, their sacrifices financed this sanctuary of refinement. The contradiction is not peripheral. It is the point. To stand in the West Gallery is to feel both awe and discomfort. The Rembrandts glow with timeless humanity. The silence is meditative. But once you know what it took to put them there, that silence becomes more complicated. You begin to ask, is it wrong to admire what was built through cruelty? Or is it wrong to ignore what beauty can become, even when it comes from dark places? The Frick collection lives in that ambiguity. It doesn't try to resolve it. The museum offers no loud disclaimers, no plaques detailing the Homestead Strike, no guided tours explaining the assassination attempt or the crushed unions. And perhaps that's part of its lasting power. It invites reflection without prescribing judgment. It allows space for contradiction, which, after all, is the essence of legacy. Frick didn't just buy art. He curated context. He didn't just build walls. He framed meaning. And in doing so, he left behind a mansion that speaks for him long after he stopped speaking. Not because it denies the truth of who he was, but because it lets visitors draw their own conclusions. The paintings do not exonerate. The limestone does not absolve. They simply endure. But we must ask, should endurance be the final measure of success? If something lasts, does that make it worthy? The Frick Mansion answers with neither affirmation nor denial. It only stands, as Frick intended, unmoved and immaculate. A monument to the belief that reputation is mutable, that taste is powerful, and that buildings, if built with enough vision, can outlive the man who made them. Today, the Frick faces new challenges. A major expansion, led by Seldorf architects, seeks to modernize facilities, expand gallery space, and accommodate larger crowds. As with every proposed change, controversy follows. Critics fear that any alteration could damage the mansion's delicate balance. Supporters argue that evolution is necessary for survival. The debate echoes the mansion's original tensions: preservation versus progress, legacy versus reinvention. Yet no matter how the museum evolves, the core experience remains unchanged. You walk through rooms where the ceilings are not too high to touch your thoughts. You see paintings close enough to hear their silence. You feel, however briefly, the intimacy of a different time, curated by a man who, for all his cruelty, understood beauty in a way few of his peers ever did. 3 houses tell the story of Henry Clay Frick. Clayton, his first fortress, born in the aftermath of violence and filled with private grief. Eagle Rock, his social experiment, where he tried to infiltrate circles that never quite embraced him. And 1 East 70th Street, his masterpiece, his thesis in stone, the place where he finally stopped chasing acceptance and began crafting legacy. They were never just houses. They were arguments. Arguments that wealth, when focused through architecture, could outlast guilt. That steel and coke could be converted, alchemically, into culture. That memory itself could be molded like marble. Whether we accept those arguments is up to us, but we cannot deny their presence. The mansion stands. The paintings hang. The garden court glows with filtered light and trickling water. The man may be gone, but his message remains, carefully framed and open to interpretation. This is what the Frick really means. It is not just a collection. It is not just a building. It is a lens through which we view the uneasy marriage of beauty and brutality, permanence and power, past and posterity. The story it tells is not simple, but it is unforgettable.